My name is Oliver Haydorn, and I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Charles Pinwell. And we will be discussing some incomprehensibles that characterize contemporary economic discourse. We're going to begin by discussing certain basic facts about the economy, which are not discussed at any great length. And we'll move from there to discuss various problems that we see and how they might be solved by some innovative solutions. So the first fact that we're going to look at, Chas, has to do with the state of affairs common to all countries, that no government does a complete set of books. That is to say, no government does a balance sheet, a complete balance sheet. There are a few that do partial balance sheets, and no government has done so far a profit and loss account for the economy as a whole. So maybe you could explain a bit what a balance sheet is and what a profit and loss account is.
Well, both balance sheets and profit and loss accounts are absolutely essential for a company to know what's going on, to measure their affairs. And balance sheets list the company's assets. Those are the things that give them an advantage. And on the other side, they list their liabilities. They are the claims upon those assets. And every investor, every shareholder, every manager, every director, they're dependent on these things to know what's going on in their company. They also do profit and loss accounts where they itemise the product that they're producing and its value. And against that, they list those things that they consume in the production. And that tells you if they're producing 3x's worth of production, but they're spending 4x's to get it, they've got a loss. If they're producing 2y's, but they're only spending 1y to get it, then they're in profit. And these are absolutely basic and essential things. And no company anywhere, even small companies, do these accounts. Governments don't. They're so important that I've brought along a copy of the balance sheet and profit and loss account of the world's largest mining company, BHP Billiton. A 2-page summary of things here, and it points out what their earnings are, what the expenses are. It also looks at all their assets, and this will be displayed, and you can go through it at your leisure. But the key point when you do that to note is at the bottom of these two items, there are the personal signatures of the chairman of the board and the chief executive officer. Now, these are the highest ranking people in the largest mining company on earth. And when they get to doing those books, profit and loss account and balance sheet, they personally sign on the dotted line because the integrity of this is the integrity of the company. This is the nature of the company, the nature of its value, the nature of its productivity and its costs. And this is so important, it's indispensable for companies. Directors of companies would go to jail if they didn't do this and they didn't do it with integrity. Governments don't do it at all. They don't do comprehensive balance sheets. There's a few sketchy ones around, not many of them. But profit and loss accounts, they never ever do them. So no country looks at what did we pay everybody to produce consumer goods, that is, what is the total income of everybody in the country, and what's the value of the consumer products that we produced. If you do that, you start to understand and you measure what's happening so you can make informed decisions.
Yes, so it is very curious then, like you were saying that no one would invest in a company without that sort of information, and yet we run countries without that sort of information. So clearly that's...
it's as though we don't want to know. And that continues to be the situation. The only profit and loss account that's ever been done for a nation was done privately a couple of years ago, and it was done for the United States for the year 2014. And I have a copy here, it will be displayed, and the count run over 3 pages. If you want to look at it in detail, you'll have to pause the video and look at the links and go through all that. But what it tells us is that in the United States, if you looked at the income of every person in the United States and you added their income up, it came in that year to $10.1 trillion. If you looked at the consumer products that were actually produced and sold, they came to $12.5 trillion. So this is a curious thing. They've only got $10.1 trillion to spend in income, but they bought $12.5 trillion worth of products, and those products were real, they existed, they were in the marketplace and they were sold. So there's questions, how could they do that? Mm-hmm. And the answer, of course, is debt.
We know, and it's, as you say, there's empirical evidence, statistical evidence to show that the United States, for example, has a profitable economy.
It does.
And if that production was sold, and it was sold because it was included in the GDP, obviously it had to be sold by some other means besides incomes. And so that's where this debt comes in, how we go, the governments go, or individuals as consumers go, or businesses go to the banking system to borrow money into existence in order to meet the costs of whatever surplus production has been produced, but for which insufficient income has been distributed. So we might emphasize this particular point, that our money supply is created by the banking system out of nothing. That is, it shouldn't be a shocking or unusual fact. Everyone should know this, but we'll explain it in greater depth for the benefit of those who might be hearing this for the first time.
Well, it could be explained with 1,000 quotes. I mean, the real authorities, they understand that no persons create money unless they're counterfeiting, and governments don't do it either. In 1694, the Bank of England was given the right to create all the money that existed. Now, the fellow that organised that bank, his name was William Patterson, and when he was advocating the value of this bank, he said, and I'm quoting from his pamphlet, A Brief Outline of the Intended Bank of England, he says, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." It was acknowledged right back then that the function of banks is to create money. They don't take in money and lend that same money to somebody else. They create a deposit, they create a loan, and when that loan is spent, it creates a deposit. So they're actually creating deposits. And that is borne out by John Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes, the most famous economist in the 20th century. And he's on quote, and at the time he was the governor of the Bank of England, he said, "There can be no doubt that all deposits are created by the banks. The banks create a loan. Nothing happens except you get some numbers in an account which you're allowed to draw on to transfer them to another account, and that process creates a deposit. But they haven't printed any notes. They've done nothing except created an enumerated abstraction in their account. Mm-hmm. That's how it's done. There are many more quotes that you could go through. Another one, perhaps, this comes from the credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank. He said, "If all the bank loans were paid, no one could have a bank deposit, and there would not be a dollar of coin or currency in circulation." The money supplies that exist in modern nations, they are all created by the banks. Every cent of that is owned by the banks. They never give it away. They only rent it, and and interest is the rent they charge. And at the end of it, you have to not only pay them the rent, you have to give the dollar back as well. So that is basically how much of modern industry is controlled and owned. Mm-hmm. And there's no getting away from that. And there are hundreds of quotes and it's well acknowledged in the top banking circles, although you'll still find lots of silly people trying to explain banking as though they loan their deposits. They don't. Nobody I know has ever had a single dollar taken out of his account to loan it to somebody else. It doesn't happen. Therefore, when somebody gets a deposit, it's a new deposit from a loan, and that's just how it works.
Right. So this borrowing from private banks, this is, as we were saying earlier, this is how we manage to supplement our income so that we can clear the market, we can distribute whatever has been produced in terms of consumer goods and services, and also ensure that businesses can cover their costs and so forth. What that means is that over time, because the rate at which we're contracting debt exceeds the rate at which it's being paid back, the debt burdens tend to grow and grow and grow.
Exactly
and
so.
we're reaching some overall debt burdens of fantastic proportions. Yeah. And we see this sort of on an aggregate level, let's say the total world debt. I think you have some interesting stats to share with that. And also on an individual or family level, when we look at things like mortgages and how much people have to borrow just to find suitable living accommodations.
Well, the total indebtedness in the world is said to be about $250 trillion. In the year for which we gave the figures for the United States, the profit of that country was $2.4 trillion. The increase in their debt was $2.3 trillion. They could only keep the economy running by creating more money, which means more debt in the present system, to about that amount. So that enabled them to keep the economy running. And we've now got to the point where there's a total debt in the world is about $250 trillion. And what is that? How can that be when we've been so productive and more prosperous over the last 100 years and more? How can it be that we get more and more debt all the time? Well, the problem is simple. The problem is that we are profitable. If we are profitable, our incomes, which are the cost of getting people to do things, is less than the price that has to be paid to settle not only the wage and salary costs, but also the historic costs and the overhead costs and a lot of these capital costs. So they create more debt. And that $250 trillion is the accumulated debt that's been necessary to finance our profitability. We're profitable, so we have to go and debt more or we can't buy it. And then the next year we're profitable again, we have to have even more debt and it accumulates. So in the end, you've got these fantastic figures, and the reason for it at core is that we are profitable. Now you see, it doesn't happen like that in companies because companies do the books. They do balance sheets and they do profit and loss accounts. And when they find that they're profitable, they actually pay their shareholders a dividend. They don't tell them to go to the accountant at the back of the business and borrow some money so that they can use their profitability. They distribute a dividend. And that's what we're suggesting that has to happen. We have to start thinking about national economies more in the same way that we do with corporations. And if they're profitable, we acknowledge that and we can consider paying a dividend as an alternative to having the debt increase every year by the amount of the profit.
As I was saying, this problem is particularly acute when it comes to housing debt. So if we look at what has happened with housing prices in most Western jurisdictions in the last few decades, we can see that the amount of money that people have to borrow in order to be able to compete in the housing market has risen phenomenally.
It's this whole business of having to increase the debt all the time so that we can afford to buy the product that's our profit. We can afford to buy product up to the extent of our costs because we've got incomes which are the costs. The rest of it we have to go into debt for. That's reached such a point that it's been difficult to get people to go into debt sufficiently to keep the economy operating. If we don't buy and consume all of our consumer products each year, they can't be replaced. We can't keep the economy operating. We go into recession, we get all sorts of problems. So the key to keeping the debt going up has basically been for the banks to finance all sorts of people to bid against each other with more and more money to push up the price of houses higher and higher. And that's really meant in the end that while there was once, like in the 1950s, there were basically single income families, married women with children didn't work. Now they work, but the whole of their income pretty much, the one income of the two income family has to go to paying the mortgage because they've just financed all sorts of people to bid against each other with money that's simply created, but it has to be repaid. So that has enslaved the population and has basically robbed us of the second income. It's all gone to pay inflated house prices. And just looking at the way that house prices have responded to that, the chart shows that the consumer price index, it went from, say, a level of 100 units to 180. The house price index went from the same start, 100 units, to 540 units. So the house prices have outstripped the consumer price index. They've had to do that because they have to keep the debt going up higher and higher and higher without it ever stopping or else slowing, or otherwise we can't afford to buy our own profit and the economy will go into recession. And all sorts of things are going to be considered in the future to try to answer this problem, and we've got some suggestions to make as well.
So we've looked at these various facts that characterize the contemporary economic situation, and we've noted that these are very interesting facts, these are very important facts, but there's something else at play here, and that is it seems to be very difficult to get people to discuss these facts openly, to debate them, to inquire more deeply about them. And the question arises, why is this? How can we explain the lack of interest, the sort of cloud of silence surrounding all of these important facts about national economies?
Well, and it is extraordinary because in every election they tell you the hip pocket nerve is the biggest question. But really, the hip pocket nerve never seems to get to the point of saying, well, hey, why do we let banks create all our money and keep it and just rent it to us and drive up the debt of every nation every year? We don't ask those sort of questions. It's as though we're not interested in the hip pocket nerve in some way. Now, we are. I reject the idea that we're not interested in our economy. After all, most people spend most of their lives working for a dollar. I mean, that's how they spend most of their time. They're not out there contemplating philosophy or reading good books or learning a language. They're there with their nose to the grindstone. Most people, most of their lives. And so it is a big issue. It's even an issue that might be worth thinking about a little bit. So there's something else that's preventing us from really looking at this thing and having the confidence to look at it.
One of the suggestions that has been made is that it is, in essence, a problem of authority. That is to say, people, the common people, won't consider these facts, won't ask these questions unless some authority tells them, communicates to them that it's okay to think this way or it's okay to ask these questions.
It's amazing how much faith people have in authority. To hear them speak, you might think otherwise, but there are some things that really make me wonder. For instance, in 2013, Brisbane had a large flood. Brisbane has a flood every 30 or 40 years and has done since the 1800s. And a few months after that, I was talking to an insurance broker, and he was amazed, and so were his staff, and so was I, that when the announcement came that there's a big flood coming, it's going to inundate a lot of Brisbane, It's going to be here in a couple of days. Their phones went mad. Clients ring up and say, does my house go underwater in a flood? Now, these weren't people that had, few of these people were just there 6 months or 2 years and didn't understand how Brisbane operates. So that was, you could understand that. These were people that had bought those houses 20 and 30 years ago and had lived in them since and had never ever asked, I wonder whether this house is underwater level or not when the next flood comes. So how can you explain that? Are they not interested, you know? They're going to lose thousands of dollars in gear. All I can say is that in those years between the previous flood in 1974, a large dam had been completed and it was supposed to provide the flood mitigation that it would never happen again. It didn't, because the very people that they trusted to have fixed the problem, that is the politicians, when it got to actually administering this flood mitigation, they'd been short of water. So when the dam got 50% full, that's where they were supposed to, that's the end of stories. The rest is just to control the floods. But it went to 60 and they thought, oh, well, we keep that water. And they went to 70, well, we've got to keep that too. And then when it went to 80 and 90, they thought, well, I don't know whether we want to let that go either. It got to 98%, and this is an earthen dam. When the water goes over that, within 20 minutes there won't be a dam. There'll be the biggest flood in history in Brisbane, 20 times worse than the best flood it ever saw. The politicians still weren't making a decision. So the staff opened the gates. They had no authority to do it. They did it because they didn't want to see the dam destroyed. They didn't want to see Brisbane destroyed with large loss of life. And the politicians that everybody trusted to betray them, even then, hadn't made a decision. So there can be big problems with trusting authorities to do the right thing. They don't necessarily want to do it. They don't necessarily even know how to do it. They haven't necessarily even thought about it. Most politicians now have never thought about the fact that governments have long given up their right to create money. They've never even thought that through. So that's one problem, deferring to authority because they must know better. The other thing I think that inhibits people is that they don't really want to, they're not confident believing something unless a lot of people believe it. President Nixon, the one that got impeached, the most recent one to get impeached, he said that the American people will never believe anything that they haven't seen on television. Only things that happen on television can be real. Now, television has never told us that money creation has been stolen away from the public. It's never told us that we're profitable, that we just don't share the profit. These critical things are not discussed. And for that reason, people not only don't have the confidence, they don't even often just get the clue to there's something there to discuss. So that's a big part of the problem. It's being overly trusting. Of course, we've all got to trust authority. We can't do everything for ourselves, but we've got to be discriminating in it if we can. And there's some questions that we're going to have to raise because in our own self-interest, there's no avoiding it.
And yes, if governments did do a set of books, then the information would at least be out there. And in that case, it would have some sort of authoritative backing and could be considered for public discussion. So,
well, that's right. If America would have done that profit and loss account, if the government would have done it instead of privately where it can be ignored, it showed that that profit of 2.4 trillion, that amounted to $7,500 for every living American and to $30,000 for every American family of 4. So once you can see those sort of numbers, you can say, well, what's going on here? We've got a profit of $30,000 for an average family, and yet all we get is debt going up by the equivalent amount. So in the end, it's probably as simple as just getting the thing measured. When science comes across some new phenomenon, they measure it. They measure whatever it is. If it's an asteroid, they measure its speed and its mass and its position and whatever else. It's a microbe, they measure various things about microbes. Measurement is the way we understand things. Now, that's what we've got to do with the economy. We've got to measure. And if we're not measuring whether we're profitable or not, and we're not measuring what our liabilities are, we don't even know what our liabilities are. Most politicians cannot name you the largest liability that their countries have. The account which we've displayed will do that, but you'll have to get a link and read the explanatory notes. But it is there. And this is a big job for the world, is to just get a few simple, honest books done so that we can proceed to understand and correct the problem.
What is the role, do you suppose, of cognitive dissonance in this question, this mystery of why these facts are not known and not discussed?
Well, we've all got worldviews, and it's a pretty painful thing changing them, it's pretty painful. The people that thought the earth was flat, they'd have been awfully upset, and resisted the idea that it might be a globe. And they come up with all sorts of arguments why it couldn't be so. I mean, that was evident in many ways. Like Copernicus, Galileo, they said that the earth went round and round the sun rather than the sun round and round the earth. Well, it created enormous controversy and a lot of trouble. People hated the idea of changing the idea about a worldview. So that's the sort of inertia in the human psyche. Cognitive dissonance, well, it's a psychological term that describes resistance to facing truths. It doesn't matter how true something is, it's irrelevant. There are people who say, I don't care if it's true or not, I just simply won't believe it. I'm told that there was a woman in England somewhere, she had never heard about a giraffe and never read about them, heard nothing, knew nothing about them, and they took it to the zoo and there's a giraffe. And she stamped her foot and she said, I simply will not believe it. I won't believe it. And that's how it is with a lot of these things, It's too disturbing. Cognitive dissonance.
So, do you suppose, when it comes to the type of cultures that we live in today and the nature of society, it seems that people are rewarded for seeking private benefit, private goods, and that there's not much of an interest or a reward for seeking the common good, for promoting the public interest.
I think that's true. To get good solutions to community problems, you have to have a sense of community. If we're all islands and we're all defending our own little patch, then there's not much chance that we're going to be able to get our head around the bigger issues. And especially if somebody's, got a little monopoly on something, They got a monopoly on ice cream, and all we're going to worry about is getting the ice cream off the bloke next door that's bought one, and we're not thinking about, and we can't think about anything that we'll never break the monopoly on ice cream. So, we have to be able to think as a community, or it's not going to go very far. Another problem we have, I think, is, I call it the problem of unconscious relationships. If we're of the opinion that somebody's got a lot of wisdom, we tend to defer to them, So there's a lot of these unconscious relationships going on, and they can be encouraged. I mean, I'm sure the bankers encourage the media to give us good feelings about them. It doesn't always work, but we end up with less bad feelings about them than we would otherwise, perhaps. So there are a lot of those relationships we don't really want to confront. We don't really want to believe that we know the local bank manager. I mean, he's just a minion anyhow, but we don't really want to think that, well, the whole world's against us, and it starts to look like that when you start to say that, well, all the money's created by banks and they keep it all. You know, it gets to that sort of situation in a practical sense, but it's not a nice thing to think about, and most of us will reject it. There's often a sense of powerlessness with individuals, especially when they're nuclear, they're on their own. You know, what can I do? Well, the question is really, what can we do? We can do anything we want to do. What can I do? Well, it's often not much, except be part of the process that turns this question into what can we do, and begin to explain it to your fellows, and trying to assist community to think as a community, and not as isolated people that can just be put one against the other. So that's an important part of trying to understand what's happening here. There are other reasons that we don't get very far. Sometimes, you know, people like ourselves talking about these problems of the creation of money not being justly arranged, there is so much what I call virtue signalling in society. You've got all sorts of leaders, politicians among them, who say things that sound, you know, I'm virtuous, you know. Oh yes, we'll do something about this, or we must all do this, or isn't this a good thing, and so on. We know that often they're not really saying I'm going to do anything. They're saying I'm indicating to you that I'm virtuous. And that's all they think they have to do. If you believe that they're virtuous, they don't have to be virtuous, because you're going to act as though they're going to be virtuous. They are virtuous, and you'll probably vote for them because they're seen to be virtuous. So that's cynicism. It's sort of, we all have to live through that and try to present as well and as often and as genuinely and answer our critics and front up and man up, and ultimately I think some credibility will come, largely because the problems are definitely not going to go away. They're going to compound, and as you've said, there are a number of them that are just going to come, whether we like it or not. They're inevitable. They're looking down the barrel of them, and they're on their way. The last thing I'd say in respect to this, why are we so inept, is that that question can only be answered by ourselves as individuals. I mean, some of us don't want to be out of line with our neighbours. Some of us are naturally timid. Some of us don't have a little confidence in that we can understand things, so we need to grow in confidence. And some of us might have all sorts of local problems that preoccupy us. We've all got to ask that question, why don't we, and why are we not addressing these really, really important questions which are compelled upon us and compelled upon a society and are going to be absolutely critical in the coming decade or two.
So we've been talking about the various factors which interfere with people asking about these facts and debating them and discussing them and so forth. There is some good news on the horizon, at least good news from our point of view, and that is, it seems that with developments like automation and other technological developments in information technologies, many, many existing jobs are going to be eliminated. And so that is going to force the issue where doing a set of books is concerned.
Yeah, these figures are everywhere, aren't they? They're saying that the Smithsonian Institute says that close to 40 million jobs will be eliminated in the United States through new technology in the next couple of 15 years or something like that. The same thing's being said here, that Australia will lose perhaps as many as 5 million jobs. I think that's an exaggeration, but that's what they've said, largely because of sophisticated warehouses being built, which are so sophisticated they can even handle retailing. Like, for instance, the big supermarkets are saying that they may eliminate at least some of their supermarkets because you just order what you want on the internet. There are these hundreds of acres of supermarket shelves will have no people there, just automated people selecting out and packaging the material and preparing it for direct dispatch to the home. So that's going to eliminate a whole lot of things, and driverless cars, and you know, it's being applied in all sorts of ways. And so, you know, unemployment looks as though it's coming. The only thing that can stop it, that they are trying, is to create useless things, like regulate building so that it's much more difficult to do building. You've got to do a lot more plans, and you've got to get more inspections, and you've got to jump through a lot more hoops. There's a great deal of that in industry now. It's, you know, it's called bureaucracy and regulation. But ultimately it's not going to work. We are going to have all these jobs eliminated.
So we have increasing technological unemployment. Obviously something will have to be done so that these people who can no longer find employment in the formal economy nevertheless will retain access to goods and services. If something isn't done, there's going to be a huge social crisis. So that's one aspect of the problem. But also with the debt levels the way they are, and you know, many commentators are making the same point, we're going to get to the stage where we will not be able to service existing debt. And so there are two sides to this. There's what's going on technologically, and then there's also sort of the problems inherent with the debt money system and the fact that it's not sustainable.
An analogy I use is that one, if you go back a couple of 100 years, the main transport system across the surface of the earth was sailing ships. And the human economy in that period was basically a case of all hands to the pumps to keep starvation, exposure, and enough clothes. Everybody worked most of the time. So that's how the economy operated. But so at sea, everybody was on the pumps. And then came an electric motor and centrifugal pumps. And they're pumping 20 times more than a man could pump by hand. A man's only a 22nd of a horsepower. A 1 horsepower motor, which seems a pretty puny motor to us, can pump as much water as 22 men. So what happened was suddenly all these people that are being employed, they don't have to man the pumps at all. So what do? Well, they can make sails perhaps, or they can scrub the decks. But there's a limit to how many sails a ship can use. You don't want to sink the ship with sails that it won't use for the next 300 years. And then, of course, along comes a sewing machine and makes sail making much easier. And a deck scrubber, if there's such a thing. I mean, you see these floor polishers running around the supermarkets all the time. So, progressively, the ship runs just as well. It's just as productive, it's more productive, but it doesn't need so much human input, which basically means the ship of state is much more productive, much more profitable than it used to be. However, we don't quite know what to do about that, except somehow to get the debt to increase and create artificial employment. And maybe in the end we'll have to go back to the Egyptian answer and employ people to go out and build stone pyramids with primitive tools. and we can call that aesthetic endeavour, or we can wrap some words around it. But if we're going to insist that people have got to work to get an income, they've got to be there forever proletariats. They can never be owners of their own companies and share in a dividend and a profit. Then that's where we're going.
One of the factors here, too, is that as labor is displaced by technology, the gap between costs and prices versus incomes that are distributed increases. And that means you have to rely on more and more debt. And with income sort of declining relative to costs, you get to the stage where you can't service these debts anymore. And, but the system, because it's a debt money system, it has to find debt money somehow. So it seems that they've come up with a new solution. I mean, they've been lowering interest rates, but now they're talking, and in some cases actually implementing a system of negative interest rates.
Well, the problem's evident from a chart that the Federal Reserve Bank in America has produced, which shows that in the year we're talking about the figures, because it's long enough to have all the figures settled, the total income from wages and salaries and all other benefits for employers only amounted to 43% of GDP. And when you add all the other incomes that individuals could get, like from dividends or interest or social security or something, it comes to about 58%. Now, it's true that it didn't have to buy all of the GDP in that year. It only had, like, personal income only has to buy the consumer products, but personal income could only buy 80% of the consumer products that were produced and sold in the United States. So that becomes a big problem. How do you get the debt to keep going up when more and more people are not really participating, don't have to participate, don't have the means of participating? So how do you get people to borrow more and more? And that has to happen. We've already mentioned the fact that we've got them to borrow more and more to buy homes. And that's been part of the problem. But we've gone further than that now. In Japan, for several years, some European countries, for instance Denmark. In Denmark, there's a bank there that's offering a negative interest rate of 0.5% a year. In other words, if you buy 100,000 euros for 10 years, you only have to pay them 95,000 euros back. And that induces you to get a debt. Now, some people will say, yeah, well, that sounds good, I'll do it. But as this problem exacerbates and less people are employed because of technology, and it becomes problematical. Okay, I can get me 100,000 euros now, but I've got to give 95 back. And I'm worried about doing that. When that time comes, well, I'd have to say, well, the negative interest rate will have to go to 1% or 1.5%. So they're stepping down from quite high rates, down and down and down. They've gone negative in some parts of the world. They're not far off it in most other parts of the world. And there are pundits saying that the United States will go negative interest rates in the not too distant future. So that raises a whole lot of questions. I mean, a whole lot of questions.
Yes. And it seems it also potentially will create a number of problems for banks and depositors. So one of the things we've noted recently here in Australia is that the government has, if I'm not mistaken, has in fact passed legislation making it illegal to exchange items in cash or with cash that cost more than $10,000. And that's because if you look at the inner logic of the system, if banks start employing a system of negative interest rates and it actually costs someone less to borrow than what they have to pay back, you get to the stage where in order for them to make their profit, they have to have a spread. So they'll start charging depositors to hold their money at the bank, at which point people will naturally say, well, I don't want to lose money, I will take it all out in cash. And so a system of negative interest rates, almost by its own inner logic, necessitates making cash illegal.
The legislation against using cash above $10,000, I mean, that's the thin edge of the wedge. That'll be reduced and reduced. And this is all being organised on the basis that ultimately we won't be able to get people to accept more debt unless we pay them to take more debt. And the only way we can get that system working is that we charge them for having money. If you own money and you got it in the bank, and the negative interest rate on loans is 1%, the interest charged on deposit will probably be about 3% to give them a 2% spread. So that creates all sorts of problems, and I don't know whether they can ultimately handle them. For instance, people can't take money out of the bank, or not much of it. That ultimately will stop cash being used altogether. People will try to put their money into things that hold value, and that will be things like ingots of copper or zinc or lead or silver or something. And then they'll go to all sorts of other things. There are other, they might be regulated too. Well, the smelters that use these, they might say, well, you've got to show that this didn't come from a private citizen who's been wickedly hoarding. So in the end, I have a bit of a joke about maybe we'll have to go to a currency that's based on baked beans. You know, something that everybody uses, like durable foods like baked beans or packeted jelly beans or rice in hermetically sealed packets or something like that. We can trade them between ourselves. We can all use them. And the only way I can regulate them is send somebody around to inspect everybody's pantry every week or two to see whether they're trading in these things. I mean, it gets quite silly. And maybe what we'll end up with, if they try to press it too far, is a type of Bitcoin that's based on durable foods. So this is all crazy stuff. It's ultimately not going to work. And you can't operate an economy efficiently without a money system. It's too hard to compute costs and therefore to understand efficiencies and to become efficient. And the whole thing's going to fall down. And like, this will be resisted mightily. But there's one way that you can solve the problem of getting more purchasing power. And that's to give up the idea of doing it as debt all the time. To issue it as a dividend, you don't have to pay dividends back. They're free. They come by the nature of your ownership of the company or your stakeholder status in the country. And when money is issued in that way, instead of it adding to debt, it will start to cancel out that $250 trillion worth of debt, because the only thing that will ever cancel that out is credit. That's a negative. You can only get rid of a negative in mathematics with a positive. That's the only thing that will do it. So you can create more negatives and more negatives. All you're going to do is get a bigger and bigger mountain of debt. You're going to get more and more resistance to borrowing money. You're going to have negative interest rates at a higher and higher level. You're going to drive the whole thing bloody mad where you can't understand it properly. You can't compute it. You can't measure it. Or the alternative is, it's you issue money as a credit. You give it away in the same way that we give the political vote out. We all get an equal share. And debts start to melt. We don't have to hide things from government and each other. We can go back to a less stressful society, think about being a community, and we can re-include those people that used to man the pump, that have been excluded and pushed away, they can re-enter on the basis they're enfranchised as owners. They're proprietors. They're not proletariat anymore. This is the end of the proletariat. The proletariat becomes an owner. He shares in the ownership of the profit of the company. Those that work to produce it, what they get is theirs. But the profit that belongs to everybody that's a shareholder in that company, which is every person, certainly above 18 or what have you, maybe children get some. That's a decision we'll make as a community if we ever become a community.
Yes, the beautiful thing about a debt-free national dividend is it solves two problems at once, right? These two looming problems on the horizon. You've got the fact that we can't put everyone in a position of employment, that it's simply not possible to have meaningful employment, full employment, with things like automation. And at the same time, we've got the fact that the existing debt-based financial system is not sustainable over the long term and cannot be maintained in a steady state of self-repeating motion. It degrades over time. So this is the stone, the national dividend is the stone that kills those two birds. That's one of the sort of the elegant things about it.
That's right. Whereas a basic income issued from taxation or debt will not do that. It perpetuates the problem. It might alleviate it, but it only alleviates it while it perpetuates it. So this national dividend, it ends it. It progressively eliminates debt from society, from the economy. There'll still be banks creating money to lend it to business to produce, but consumption will be funded basically by the national dividend. So we fund production in the normal way we do it now with bank loans. We fund consumption, at least to the extent that it's inadequate because income from employment is not sufficient. We fund it by issuing credit, and that will go to cancel out the debts of industry when industry gets it for the goods that they produced and sold. So it's a simple system, it works. It's not excessive, we're creating actually less money than is being created now, but we're creating it as credit, not debt. And for that reason, we de-escalate the whole dysfunctional system.
And on that note, we'll ask our viewers if they have any comments or questions to leave them in the comments section. And we'll look forward to seeing you again the next time we post another riveting video on this or a similar related subject.
Thanks for joining us.